Welcome back. Conversations, episode 5. Hard to believe that we are already almost a month into this. Thank you guys for listening, whether you have been here the entire time or this is your first episode. Either way, I'm very grateful for you lending your time to listen to this show. If you haven't already done so, or if this is the first time that you're listening, make sure to hit that like, subscribe button wherever you're listening to your podcasts. We are on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and as of last week, we are on iHeartRadio as well. The subscribe will do a lot for us moving forward. Also, you can follow us on other socials as well. We're at Conversations Pod at Instagram. We have a Facebook, and on X, it's at kbex_ATC. So lots of ways to follow us, lots of ways to get the content, and if you do subscribe on one of the platforms, that makes it easier to listen to us in the future. It'll show up when we publish a new episode, which at this point we have a pretty consistent cadence of once a week, and we'll try and continue to do that moving forward so that you know what to expect. Got a lot to cover today. Lots of sports stories, no shortage of them over the past week. I'm going to bounce around a little bit today. Start off with a couple of shakeups in the collegiate sports world. Move over to college football in the week ahead briefly. We got a really big one coming up. It should be a lot of fun. And then we'll end with a top 5 ranking from yours truly. And the topic of that is a little thing called You'll See. So hopefully you'll stick around for the entire episode to get to that. If not, and you decide you just want to go straight to that chapter, that's all right too. I'm glad you're here either way. But kicking things off, as I mentioned, wanted to start with a couple of shakeups in collegiate athletics that I found to be interesting. I think one of them is probably overdue at this point, unfortunately, and another one was a bit of a surprise. But it is an interesting week, potentially a bad week for you if you're a fan of a program that wears orange. And the first one that I'll go ahead and focus on is Oklahoma State, which has relieved Mike Gundy of his duties as the head coach at Oklahoma State. This feels to some extent like euthanasia. It's been a tough last year and a half for the Cowboys. Seemingly the bottom has just dropped out for that program. They were not too far from the college football playoff just a few seasons ago. In 2021, they were in that Big 12 title game, and it looked like things were going well for Gundy and company. But after a 3-9 season last year where they were blown out in a number of games and something seemed off, it was seemingly a make it or break it year coming into 2025. And the 1-2 record that they have so far before Gundy was relieved of his duties really doesn't tell the full story because it was not competitive. It was kind of sad to watch, honestly, for those first 3 games. And it's interesting because Gundy really has been the most successful coach at that program. Oklahoma State football was not known for much prior to him arriving there in 2005 as the head coach. Of course, he was there with the program for several seasons beforehand, but took over the program in 2005, so was one of the most tenured coaches in college football at the same school, and he did really well. I'll go ahead and rattle off some of his more impressive accolades. In those 20 seasons, or 19 and change, he was 170-90 overall, and had just one losing season since 2005 prior to last year, and that first season was that only losing season. Other than that, he had been able to keep the program above 500, which was really impressive, and qualified for 18 bowl games during that period, was 12-6 in those bowl games, and those weren't just throwaway bowl games either. There were a couple of Fiesta Bowl victories in there, 2011 and 2021. He was a 3-time Big 12 Coach of the Year, and in 2011, that year that they won the Fiesta Bowl, he was the Bear Bryant Award recipient, which is a National Coach of the Year award. Now, most of you that aren't huge Oklahoma State fans and didn't know all of that background about Gundy probably knew him to some extent thanks to his viral moment in 2007, his "I'm a Man" speech. And that really endeared himself, I think, to the national fan base. Certainly the media ran with that. Funny story about that, actually, and I won't go into too much detail there, but the rant made it seem like he was actually defending his players. But if you know more about the story, you would find out it isn't quite so innocent. But because of that, he made a name for himself nationally, and I think, like myself, a lot of you were probably a little bit sad to see Gundy go. It's going to be tough, I think, for Oklahoma State to replace Gundy. Yes, I agree that given the way that the trajectory of the program has been going here over the last year and change, it's probably time for somebody else to step in there. It appears potentially that the culture has dissipated to the extent that Gundy himself couldn't revert course and get back to his winning ways anytime soon. But Oklahoma State is by no means a blue blood in college football. And being able to find somebody who can come in and quickly turn that program around is going to be a pretty big undertaking. In fact, they're likely going to have to go after somebody who has shown an ability to do more with less. Gundy himself last year had mentioned some of the struggles that he had had in the NIL era, even going as far as to say that there wasn't really enough money within the program to be competitive with some of the other schools that were essentially buying players, as we know does happen in college football today. And that's very interesting to hear from a guy like Gundy, because Oklahoma State is actually one of the first programs, you could say, that really got a huge boost from monetary donations with T. Boone Pickens back in the early 2000s. And Pickens made it a clear point. He wanted to turn his program, Oklahoma State, into a winner. And for the most part, he was successful. They were able to get that new stadium. They brought Gundy in. Gundy was able to do some pretty good things with the program. It wasn't always squeaky clean, of course. I think it was 2013 or somewhere around that time where he was accused of potentially paying his players. But as we all know, that kind of thing was going on at a lot of programs. And it wasn't a matter of whether or not most programs were doing it. It was a matter of whether or not you got caught red-handed. So, not to say that I advocate for that by any means, but he wasn't necessarily doing anything that any other big-time program was trying to do. And if it's true that Oklahoma State is really struggling financially at this point, number one, T. Boone is probably rolling over in his grave, seeing what has happened to the program just 6 years after his death in 2019. But in addition, it's going to be hard to bring somebody in who can turn that program around quickly without the kind of financial backing that they seemingly had for some time. You know, perhaps the only thing other than this really quick descent over the past year or so that Gundy has done wrong is he wasn't able to beat his main rival. The 4-15 record that he had against Oklahoma in the Battle of Bedlam is a record in an in-state rivalry that a lot of other coaches would have been in severe hot water well prior to the 20-year mark. And it's interesting that that wasn't something that was brought up more often nationally with Gundy, because the Oklahoma losses to some extent derailed what would have otherwise been really, really good seasons. So I don't know that I can speculate at this point on who might be a good fit at Oklahoma State, but I can say with some level of confidence that it's going to be a pretty tough road to get back to the level of success that Gundy was able to find there in Stillwater. And I, for one, hope that they're able to find it. Gundy was a Oklahoma State man. He was a quarterback with the program in the late 80s, and other than a few stops for 4 or 5 years in the late 90s, he was at Oklahoma State for the entirety of his coaching career as well. So this is a guy who I think really believed in the program, really wanted to win, wanted to try to do anything he could to help it. And if he's not able to do it, I'm not sure who is. But switching gears to the other program with a pretty notable shakeup this week. This one I'm not as sad to see, but it still is a pretty big shakeup, is Bruce Pearl announcing on Monday that he is stepping down as the head coach of the Auburn Tigers basketball program. Now, this one is particularly interesting and surprising, given that Pearl had just taken the team to the Final Four this year, and he has turned Auburn into a perennial contender in college basketball, something that they were not before he got there. In fact, prior to Pearl coming to Auburn, the team had just one winning season in the SEC the prior 16 years. And in the 11 years that Pearl spent with the program, he made the tourney 6 times. It would have been 7 had COVID not happened. He had 5 SEC titles and 232 wins as head coach of the program. Those last 2 stats are both school records at Auburn. So needless to say, this has been the most successful stretch of Auburn basketball in the history of the program. And this is a guy that is pretty abruptly leaving it. Now, there were some rumors that he was thinking about his exit plan for a little while. There were actually some other rumors that suggested he might have a political run at Senate. Now, those are not the reasons that he decided to step down. He's actually going to remain as a special assistant to the athletic department head moving forward. But the decision that he made and the timing of it is what I'm not sure I love about this story. Now, I'm not one to suggest nepotism because I don't know the full story here, but it certainly has some of the feeling of it, because the announcement, along with Bruce's departure from head coach, is that his son Steven will be taking over the program effective immediately. Steven, if you don't know much about him, has been an assistant on Pearl's staff for several years now. Prior to that, he played for his dad at Tennessee. But after his playing career, he actually went into the market and was a medical sales rep. And believe it or not, after his medical sales rep days, he went straight to his dad's program where he started and has worked his way up to the special assistant and was responsible for the defensive tactics for the team this past season. Now, again, this is a program now that has made its way into perennial contender status in college basketball. And they just gave a kid, I say kid, he's a few years older than I am, but they just gave a guy with no prior head coaching experience and no coaching experience whatsoever outside of his own father's program a 5-year contract and the keys to a pretty expensive sports car at this point. And I just find that kind of interesting given the abrupt nature of Bruce's retirement because, again, with the rumors, there were some rumblings that the family and the athletic department were talking about the succession plan some years ago, and Steven's name was brought up as the heir apparent, and they weren't able to figure it out at the time. But here we are, just a couple of months before the 2025-2026 season, and Bruce announces he's stepping down. Well, that doesn't give the program a lot of time to find their solution. And lo and behold, there's Bruce's son right there ready to take over. Now, I'm not predicting what Steven's going to be able to do with the program. They probably would have been a top 25 team preseason if Bruce was still coaching. Let's see what happens there with that. Not that it matters too much because we'll get to find out pretty quickly how this team is looking. But you've got a team who lost a number of pieces from that Final Four run, and you've got a guy who is very, very green at the head coaching position. And I don't know. It's interesting. If there are any Auburn fans listening, leave a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts about what you think about this move. Perhaps I'm oversimplifying the situation with Steven and how instrumental he had been to the success of the Tigers over the years. They were, from a metrics perspective, one of the better teams defensively in college basketball last year. So perhaps there is something to his abilities, and we'll get to see that. But it really smells a little fishy down there at Auburn. So we'll see how they're able to handle that. But moving back to college football, we've got a big, big weekend coming up. Week 5 is arguably the biggest on the schedule so far this season. I think it trumps week 1 in that regard. A number of games in the SEC that are can't miss action, and the Big Ten has a few of them too. And I think that, especially with the Big Ten matchups, these big games in the middle of the season that are not just one-offs. They're not just non-conference games that are going to prepare teams for the conference schedule. These are legitimate conference games that are going to have an impact on whether or not these teams will be able to make it to their conference title games and possibly the playoff. And in the Big Ten in particular, you've got a few matchups that a few years ago would not have been conference matchups. Washington and Ohio State, USC and Illinois, Oregon and Penn State. All 3 of those would have been out-of-conference games as recently as 2023. And I had a buddy who was visiting the Northeast last week, and every time he goes out there, he mentions to me how the Northeast doesn't really seem to have as much interest in college football, and I agree with that. It's a regional sport. There's not as much interest there because there's not as many blue blood programs up there that people would tune in to care about. They've got their pro teams, and they're pretty into that, and why would they watch a bunch of college kids down in the Southeast every week, right? But with these matchups that we have this weekend, that changes the game a little bit for college football. Now you have multiple time zones that are going to be interested in these games, and maybe the Northeast won't be interested. Maybe they'll look at it and say, oh, well, it's just another game. What's the difference? Ohio State plays big teams sometimes, so what? But at the same time, this might be an avenue towards changing the narrative a little bit as far as college football is concerned. I could certainly see these former Pac-10, Big Ten matchups that used to be reserved primarily for the occasional out-of-conference game in the regular season or the Rose Bowl, prompting some people that might not have been as interested in college football before taking a look at the slate on Saturday. And the nice thing about this is these games aren't going to happen once every 5 years. You're going to get these games again and again. Now, maybe they won't be exactly these games, but you're going to get the former Pac-10 teams swapping over and playing the big boys in the Big Ten, the historic big boys. So this is interesting for college football. I'm very curious to see what the numbers are going to look like for those games, especially the Big Ten ones. The SEC ones I think will do just fine. But specifically, I'd like to see in those markets that historically have not been as strong for college football, are they interested in these games that are big, that historically have been reserved for these January or early August, early September matchups? We'll have to see. But I think there's a possibility that it could be that way. So definitely something to keep an eye on if you're a fan of the continued development of college football on the landscape. But even if you're not so interested in that, again, this is a game weekend that really is can't miss. There's great games all day. A lot of shakeup is going to happen in the top 25 because of the number of teams playing each other. And even outside of the top 25, there's a number of games that I look at and I say, hey, that could be a real trap game. That Notre Dame Arkansas game is one of those for me. I also look at Auburn and Texas A&M as another game where you better watch out for the underdog in that one because it's going to be tooth and nail, I think, in both of those matchups. But don't want to focus too much on that one. If you're interested in more in-depth coverage of the games, check out Around the Corn Sports blog. My Week 5 preview for college football is up now, and you can see my picks as well as some of the best games that are happening this weekend. But I do want to transition to what I teased a little bit earlier, which is a top 5 ranking. I don't do a lot of these, and I think they're fun, definitely opinion-based. But another thing that was brought up to me this week, and it was asked of me, was, hey, are you going to cover the Ryder Cup this weekend in the podcast? And I thought about it a little bit and wasn't sure whether or not I was going to do this, but I've decided that I can incorporate it in a way. So the list that I want to share with you guys today is my top 5 international sports competitions. And to clarify what I mean by that a little bit, the requirement that I put on this ranking is that the teams or the individuals within these competitions must represent their countries only. So they can't be teams or sponsors or something that's not associated with the country that would be the lead, if you will, in terms of what they're representing. So unfortunately for you cycling fans, things like the Tour de France are disqualified from this list because, yes, they're riding for their country to an extent, but they're also associated with teams, and the teams are really what come first if you're a fan of that sport. So those types of events will not be included here, but I did come up with a pretty robust list of things that I considered, and there were a lot of good ones that I left off. I'll go ahead and I'll start just by mentioning a few of them that just missed out in the top 5 here. And I've got the Cricket World Cup on there. I can't include that on my own list. Yes, it is one of the most watched events in the world. It's one of the more popular sports globally, but I don't know the first thing about cricket. So this can't fit my list. If there's any cricket viewers out there that want to give me a hard time about that, please do it. Please tell me that cricket is something that we really should be learning about or covering on this podcast. I'll probably have to have you on in order to make that happen, but I'd love to do it. But yeah, Cricket World Cup can't make this list. Another one that barely missed was the Olympic basketball tournament. I think that's one of the main events in the Summer Olympics that people like to watch. But at the end of the day, I don't know whether or not the players and the fans are as interested in that event as they are on some of the other events that I've listed in the top 5. And then narrowly missing this list was the World Baseball Classic. And that one was interesting for me because I think it's a good event. I like what they've done with it over the years. They do tend to switch up the format a little bit every time, and that does make it hard for casual viewers to understand exactly what's going on when they jump into it. And the other thing, and this is one of the main issues that I have with it, is that the time of year that they hold it is tough if you're interested in some other sports. You've still got college basketball ramping up. You've got some other things that are going on at the same time. And most people think when the World Baseball Classic is occurring, you're still talking about spring training for baseball. So it's at an interesting time of year. I think they actually have a valid reason for doing it that way, so that they can get the pro players to play in the tournament. But I think it is just on the outside looking in terms of the top international competitions that we have to choose from as fans. So with that said, I'll start with number 5 here, and this one is, I think, a little bit of a unique take because it's not very old. I've got the Four Nations face-off, and I will be the first to say I'm not a huge hockey fan. I don't have a ton of hockey knowledge. I do like to keep side tabs on it, just to generally understand what's going on, but it is not something that I could cover on this podcast by any means without a little bit of help. And What I liked about what I saw from the Four Nations Cup this year is that it seemed that the players were very into it, and that got the fans into it. Um, I I have seen very few sports that can compete with hockey in terms of the players having an invested interest in the international game. Um, there's another competition on this list later on that I'll mention that I think does rival that, but outside of that one, I think hockey is at the top in terms of how important these international competitions are to the players. And with this one in particular, it's interesting because it was an alternate option to the traditional NHL All-Star game. And I think actually that's another reason that I think this one is so interesting is that the Four Nations face-off was so much better than anything they could have put on that would have been NHL only. And I know they've tinkered around with their format with that in the past as well. And this one took the cake by a mile in terms of how interesting it was. And hopefully they continue to go forward with it. I know there's been some rumblings about whether or not they want to continue it yearly or if they want to make it biannual or every 4-year thing to make sure that it remains novel. But what I'll say with the NHL is that they figured out something with their All-Star game that the rest of the major American sports leagues have not been able to yet. And I would almost argue that having it every year is a good thing. Even though there will be less novelty to it, it's something that will actually get the fans to watch. So if they can get the players on board for that, I would love to see it as an every year thing. Moving on to number 4 is the Six Nations Championship. Now, some of you may not know what that is. It is an international rugby union tournament. It, of course, from its name, is Six Nations. It's the traditional United Kingdom, Ireland, England, Wales, and Scotland, as well as France and Italy. And what I find interesting about this tournament is its longevity. It's actually about 50 years older than the FIFA World Cup. So it's one of the longest running international sports competitions that is still in play today. So it's got a lot of history, and those nations are all in on this. And I've got one buddy who's a big rugby guy. I'd love to have him on at some point to talk about the Six Nations when it comes around, because it is one of those events where if you have not had a chance to go to a bar when one of those games is going on, you're missing out. That's a bucket list thing if you can't get to one of the games. And for me, this tournament, going to one of the games, would be a bucket list item for me, even though I don't know that much about rugby. It's that important to these nations, and similarly to the hockey, these players get into it and they really treat it as an important event, despite the fact that they've got their professional responsibilities as well. Number 3, and really the reason that I've got this list going, is because we are upon Ryder Cup week. And yes, the Ryder Cup does make this list. I've got it slotted in as number 3. The Ryder Cup for me has not always been something that I've paid a ton of attention to, but as the years have gone on and I've gotten a little bit more into golf, and I think you could say that the demographics with regards to golf have shifted a little bit as well. I think these types of competitions are very attractive to especially the younger crowd with regards to golf, because this is an opportunity where, similar to the Six Nations Cup, you can go into a bar and find an entire group of people that are doing nothing but watching what's going on with the pairings throughout the weekend. I actually experienced that firsthand for the last Ryder Cup. I was out in Baltimore and we walked into a bar, and it was a college football Saturday, and there were some pretty big games that were going on, but most of the attention was on the Ryder Cup. And, especially when you're talking about this sentiment that it's the United States against everybody, and in this case, everybody being the European Union, I think that there's a lot of pride on the line for the fans. But what is really cool to see is that the golfers are so into this. And watching some of these guys week in and week out on the PGA Tour, on the Live Tour, they're obviously excited at certain moments depending on what kinds of success they can have on the tour, but it pales in comparison to the amount of emotion they will let out during the Ryder Cup. And I think that's what's so fun about watching this event, is that these guys really care. They really want to beat the guy on the other side, and they'll let the crowd see it. It is one of the few events in golf, professional golf, where the players understand how much the crowd can help the momentum that they may be building within their match. And that's just not something that you see very often in this game, but it is something that you get consistently in the Ryder Cup. So that one's going to be really fun to watch this weekend. I'm sure I'll have it on a screen in addition to all the college football, and I know a lot of you watching or listening to this show will as well. So that one definitely makes the list. So there you go. That's our Ryder Cup plug for the weekend. But moving on to number 2, I've got the men's Olympic hockey tournament. Now, not too much explanation needs to be said for this one. I've already talked about the passion that the players have for the international game. I think that the Olympic tournament is, a notch up, of course, from the Four Nations face-off, just because of what it means to the countries. You're contending for medals, and it's a situation where definitely the fans push for these guys to play in this tournament. Some events, and this is a good example because this is one, are in the middle of the professional season. So the NHL guys have a lot to lose here. If there's an injury in the Olympic tournament, they may be putting their professional teams at risk upon the return, depending on what ends up happening to them in the tournament. And that's something that the fans have to worry about as well. And the fact that the fans and the players seem to be all in on it, and they want those guys to play in the tournament anyway, just shows you how important this tournament is. And speaking specifically from an American standpoint, obviously we've had a couple of gold medal matches. Well, not gold medal matches, but matches in the Olympic tournament that are legendary as far as sports are concerned. Of course, the Miracle on Ice, which was my mistake there, not a gold medal game. But then the 2010 game, which was a gold medal game between the U.S. and Canada, stands out for me, honestly, as one of the best sporting events that I've ever been able to watch live. And like I said, hockey is not number 1, 2, or 3 for me in terms of, my favorite sports, but that game itself stands out as one of the best events that I've ever seen. So there we are. We've got 2, 3, 4, and 5, and you probably know which one I'm going with here, just based on process of elimination. It's, of course, the FIFA World Cup. I don't think there's any argument here. Well, sure, there's an argument. Put it in the comments. I want to hear your thoughts. Let me know what your list is. But for me, no argument whatsoever. The FIFA World Cup is far and away the most important, the most exciting international tournament in sports, and it's watched by everybody. It's going to take a massive step up next year when it's hosted by the U.S. I think there's a lot of people that are going to look at this like an event to be seen at, to be at, to say you were at it. So it's going to be a party. It always is a party. The players obviously love it. What can you not like about the World Cup? I mean, other than, some of the side stuff that goes on with ethics and things of that nature. But, that aside, the play on the field and the event itself is unmatched. That's got to be number 1 for me. I'm sure for a lot of you, it's number 1 for you as well. But there you have it. That's my top 5 list. If you liked this, let me know. We can do top rankings lists more often. I know they're controversial and they probably bring up a lot of comments from you guys, the listeners, and that's what the show is all about, is having this conversation. So let me know what you thought there. Unfortunately, no mailbag items this week, so hopefully next week we'll have some things to talk about from you guys, and we'll go ahead and hit it hard if we do have that. But hopefully everybody enjoys the weekend. A lot going on. It's going to be a good weekend. I'm ready to sit back and watch college football and the Ryder Cup all weekends, and hopefully you guys have the opportunity to do something similar. So enjoy it, and until next time, take it easy, Shuckers.